Toi with graven bnoi dung chuan thun, a with circumflexem ton trong mot koi van band away, not toi with graven bnoi dung chuan thun, a with circumflexem ton. The appointment with the attorney took place on a clear Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Daniel's funeral. Eleanor arrived 10 minutes early, as she always did, wearing a navy wool coat and carrying a slim leather portfolio under her arm. The law office occupied the second floor of a red brick building on Main Street, its windows overlooking a small park where children were playing near a fountain. Life moved forward outside without hesitation. Inside, Eleanor sat across from Margaret Collins, an estate lawyer she had trusted for more than a decade. Margaret listened carefully as Eleanor explained her intention to revise the trust documents. There was no anger in her voice, no dramatic declaration. She spoke with precision, outlining asset allocations, successor trustees, and charitable provisions as if she were reviewing a quarterly report. "I would like to establish a permanent scholarship in Daniel's name," she said calmly. 4-year tuition assistance, renewable annually, for students pursuing engineering. The endowment should be structured so that the principal remains intact. Margaret nodded, taking notes. "And regarding your daughter-in-law?" she asked gently. Eleanor paused for a moment before responding. "She will receive a defined distribution, but no administrative control, no discretionary authority, and no access to underlying principle." It was not punishment. It was boundary. When Eleanor left the office, the documents were not yet finalized, but the framework was set in motion. She drove home along the shoreline, watching sailboats cut steady lines across the water. Daniel had loved those boats. He used to talk about buying one someday, after expanding his consulting firm. Vanessa had encouraged that dream enthusiastically. Eleanor remembered a dinner from the previous spring when Vanessa had said, half joking and half serious, "Once the investments mature, we will not have to think about money again." At the time, Eleanor had interpreted it as optimism. Now she heard the sentence differently. That afternoon, Vanessa arrived earlier than usual. She carried her phone in one hand and a folder in the other. "I spoke with a real estate broker," she announced without preamble. "The market is strong right now. Properties in this area are selling above asking price. If we list within the next 60 days, we could maximize value." Eleanor was standing at the kitchen island slicing apples for a pie she had promised to deliver to a neighbor. She did not stop cutting. "There are no plans to list this property," she said evenly. Vanessa's posture stiffened. "You may not want to manage it alone." Eleanor placed the knife down carefully and wiped her hands on a towel. "I have managed this household for 43 years, she replied. "I am fully capable." The silence that followed felt dense. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, then softened again into practiced concern. "I am only thinking about what Daniel would have wanted," she said. Eleanor held her gaze. "Daniel wanted stability. He trusted me to maintain it." Vanessa did not argue further, but her jaw tightened in a way that did not escape notice. After she left, Eleanor sat at the dining room table and opened a folder of old correspondence. Among the papers were emails Daniel had exchanged with her about business expansions and investment options. In one message he had written, "I feel better knowing you are overseeing the long-term plan. Vanessa likes to move quickly." Eleanor read that sentence twice. There was no accusation in it, only contrast. That evening she received a notification from her bank indicating an attempted inquiry into one of Daniel's former joint accounts. The request had been flagged and denied because authorization credentials did not match. Eleanor did not panic. She printed the alert and placed it in a new folder labeled documentation. The next morning she called Thomas Green and asked him to add an additional layer of security verification to every account. Voice confirmation. Written authorization. No exceptions. Later that day, Vanessa returned, her tone sharper than before. "I tried to review Daniel's account history," she said. "Access appears restricted." Eleanor folded her newspaper neatly and set it aside. "It is restricted," she confirmed. "All financial matters are being handled through my advisor." Vanessa exhaled slowly. "I am his wife." "You were his wife?" Eleanor corrected gently. "And you will be provided for within the structure he agreed to years ago." The distinction landed heavily. Vanessa's eyes flashed, but she did not raise her voice. "You are shutting me out," she said quietly. Eleanor did not respond immediately. She rose, walked to the window overlooking the sound, and watched the tide roll toward the rocks below. I am preserving what Daniel entrusted to me, she said at last. Vanessa stood still for a long moment, then gathered her bag. This is not over, she said, her composure thin but intact. When the front door closed, Eleanor remained at the window. The water moved steadily, indifferent to human tension. She did not feel victorious. She felt alert. Grief still lived in every corner of the house, but it no longer clouded her judgment. That evening, Margaret Collins emailed draft amendments for review. The scholarship endowment had been structured at $8 million, generating annual tuition grants without touching principal. The remaining assets were allocated into controlled trusts with explicit limitations. Vanessa's distribution would be defined and finite. No discretion. No acceleration clauses. Eleanor read each paragraph carefully, making minor adjustments in wording. She understood that wealth did not guarantee peace. It required stewardship. Daniel had once told her that her greatest strength was patience. Now patience would be her shield. As she signed the preliminary approval documents electronically, she felt a quiet steadiness return. The house was still empty of her son's laughter, but it was no longer vulnerable. Outside, the evening light faded across Long Island Sound, and Eleanor Whitmore prepared for the next move not with anger, but with clarity. By the third week after the funeral, the rhythm of visits shifted. Vanessa no longer arrived with polite pretexts or carefully measured concern. She began coming with purpose. One Tuesday morning she stepped into the Whitmore house, without waiting to be invited further than the foyer, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Eleanor was seated at the breakfast table reviewing printed drafts of the amended trust documents. She looked up calmly as Vanessa set her handbag down with unusual force. "We need to talk honestly," Vanessa said, her voice controlled but tight. Eleanor folded the pages neatly and placed them beside her teacup. "Honesty is always welcome," she replied. Vanessa remained standing. "Daniel and I built a life together. We made plans. We talked about expanding the business, about traveling, about children. All of that assumed financial backing." Eleanor observed her carefully. There were no tears now, no tremor in her voice. Only expectation. "Daniel built his company with hard work," Eleanor said evenly. "And I supported him when support was requested." Vanessa crossed her arms. "You supported him because you could. You have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes." The sentence hung in the air, heavier than intended. Eleanor did not flinch. "Wealth is not measured by how quickly it is distributed," she answered. "It is measured by how responsibly it is preserved." Vanessa's composure thinned. "Preserved for who?" she demanded quietly. Eleanor rose from the table and walked toward the living room, signaling the conversation would continue on her terms. Vanessa followed. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the framed photographs lining the walls. Eleanor stopped in front of Daniel's graduation portrait. "Preserved for purpose," she said. "For impact that lasts beyond any one person." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "You are creating a foundation," she said suddenly. It was not a question. Eleanor turned slowly. "Yes." Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. "You are diverting money that should support Daniel's household." "Daniel no longer has a household," Eleanor replied, her tone steady but not cruel. "He entrusted me with long-term stewardship. I am honoring that trust." Vanessa's breath came faster now, though she kept her volume low. "You are shutting me out of everything." Eleanor returned to her seat. "You will receive what is outlined in the revised documents. It is fair. It is secure." Vanessa stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You think I married Daniel for money," she said. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She thought of past conversations, of quick investment ideas, of impatient questions about liquidity. "I think Daniel loved you," she said at last. "I also think he sometimes moved too quickly to please you." The statement was gentle but firm. Vanessa looked away first. Silence filled the room, thick and unmistakable. After several seconds she spoke again, this time more controlled. "If you believe I am not entitled to administrative control, then I will seek legal counsel." Eleanor nodded once. "You are free to do so." The simplicity of the response unsettled Vanessa more than resistance would have. She had expected negotiation, perhaps guilt. Instead she encountered structure. Vanessa retrieved her handbag and paused at the doorway. "You cannot take everything from me," she said quietly. Eleanor met her eyes. I am not taking anything. I am protecting what was never yours to control. The front door closed with deliberate precision. The house returned to its familiar quiet, but something fundamental had shifted. Eleanor walked to her study and opened the folder labeled documentation. She added a brief note summarizing the conversation, dated and timed. Not out of fear, out of discipline. Later that afternoon, Margaret Collins called to confirm the amended trust documents were finalized and notarized. The scholarship endowment had been formally established. $8 million allocated, principal protected. The remaining assets were divided into structured trusts with defined distributions and clear limitations. Eleanor listened carefully as Margaret reviewed each clause. There is no ambiguity, the attorney concluded. Your intentions are explicit. Eleanor thanked her and ended the call. She stood by the window overlooking Long Island Sound. The tide was high, waves pressing against the rocky shoreline in steady rhythm. For a moment she allowed herself to feel the absence fully. Daniel would never stand beside her there again. He would never argue about interest rates or tease her about her conservative investment strategies. The grief remained sharp, but it no longer clouded her perception. Wealth had revealed what loss alone might not have. In the days that followed, Vanessa's visits stopped. Instead, a formal letter arrived from a law firm in Stamford requesting a review of estate allocations. Eleanor read it carefully and placed it in the documentation folder without visible reaction. She contacted Margaret immediately and forwarded a copy. We anticipated this possibility, Margaret assured her. Your position is legally sound. Eleanor closed her laptop and sat quietly for several minutes. The house no longer felt vulnerable. It felt guarded, not by security systems or gates, but by clarity. At 71, she had learned that money could not shield her from tragedy. It could, however, protect the integrity of what her son had trusted her to manage. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. Eleanor Whitmore did not feel triumphant. She felt steady, and steady, she understood, was far more powerful than emotional reaction. The formal letter from the Stamford law firm arrived on a gray Monday morning, delivered in a thick cream envelope that felt heavier than its contents justified. Eleanor opened it at the kitchen island with the same measured calm she applied to quarterly financial reports. The language was polite but assertive, outlining Vanessa Whitmore's intention to contest certain estate structures on the grounds of marital expectation and implied reliance. Eleanor read every line twice, then placed the document neatly beside her planner. She did not sigh. She did not react outwardly. Instead, she brewed a fresh pot of coffee and carried her mug into the study where the safe sat hidden behind the landscape painting. She unlocked it with steady hands and retrieved the finalized trust documents along with the documentation folder she had been maintaining. Dates, times, copies of alerts, notes summarizing conversations. Precision layered upon precision. By 10 o'clock she was seated across from Margaret Collins once again, the letter unfolded neatly on the desk between them. Margaret adjusted her glasses and reviewed the contents carefully. This is a pressure tactic, she said at last. They are testing whether you will negotiate. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Will it succeed? She asked evenly. Margaret shook her head. Your documents are airtight. Daniel's original signatures, the timing of the trust formation, the amendments properly executed before any challenge. There is no coercion, no ambiguity. If this proceeds to court, it would be costly for her with little probability of success. Eleanor nodded once. Costly. The word lingered. Not financially for her. Emotionally for everyone involved. When she returned home, she found Vanessa's SUV already parked in the driveway. That alone told her the letter had not been sent without coordination. Vanessa stood in the foyer when Eleanor entered, her expression composed but tense. You received it, Vanessa said quietly. Yes, Eleanor replied. She set her handbag on the side table and removed her coat with deliberate slowness. Vanessa's posture softened slightly, as though preparing to negotiate. This does not have to become adversarial, she began. We can reach a compromise privately. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. A compromise suggests something was promised and withheld, she said. That is not the case. Vanessa exhaled, frustration breaking through the careful exterior. Daniel believed I would be secure. He said as much. Eleanor walked toward the living room, signaling again that she would control the setting of this conversation. Vanessa followed. Daniel's security plan involved long-term stewardship, Eleanor said once they were seated. He understood the structure in place. He reviewed it with me more than once. Vanessa shook her head. He would not have wanted me dependent on monthly distributions. You are not dependent, Eleanor replied. You are provided for within a defined framework. There is a difference. The distinction landed heavily between them. For a moment Vanessa looked less calculating and more wounded. You never trusted me, she said softly. Eleanor considered that carefully. Trust is built over time, she answered. So is responsibility. Vanessa's eyes flashed. I stood by Daniel. I supported his ambitions. Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. And I funded many of them when cash flow was uncertain. That support required oversight. Silence settled over the room. The ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase sounded louder than usual. Vanessa rose abruptly and paced toward the window overlooking the sound. You are hiding behind paperwork, she said. Eleanor did not raise her voice. Paperwork is how serious matters are handled. Vanessa turned back toward her, shoulders squared. If this goes forward legally, it will be public. Eleanor nodded once. Then it will be public. The calm acceptance unsettled Vanessa more than resistance would have. She stood still for several seconds before speaking again, her voice lower now. Is there truly nothing you are willing to adjust? Eleanor thought briefly of Daniel at 10 years old, proudly holding his first savings bond. She thought of the night he had signed the original trust documents, joking that his mother would outlive them all and keep everything balanced. There is one thing, Eleanor said finally. Vanessa's eyes lifted with cautious hope. You may choose dignity, Eleanor continued. Withdraw the challenge. Accept what has been structured fairly. Preserve Daniel's memory without conflict. The hope faded from Vanessa's expression, replaced by controlled anger. You are asking me to walk away from what could have been, she said. Eleanor's gaze remained steady. I am asking you to walk away from what was never yours to control. Vanessa's composure fractured briefly before she gathered her handbag. This is not finished, she said again, though her certainty sounded thinner than before. When the door closed, Eleanor did not immediately move. She sat quietly, listening to the echo of the latch settling into place. Outside, waves rolled steadily against the shoreline rocks, indifferent to disputes over inheritance. Eleanor rose and walked to the study once more. She added a note to the documentation folder summarizing the exchange. She then opened her laptop and reviewed the scholarship endowment confirmation from the bank. The first group of applicants would be evaluated in the spring. Young students, full of ambition, unaware of the tension that had secured their opportunity. Eleanor felt no triumph in that thought, only purpose. Wealth, she understood now more clearly than ever, was a tool. It could be used to manipulate or to build. She had chosen the latter long ago. Vanessa had chosen confrontation. The law would decide the rest if necessary. But as evening settled over Long Island Sound, and the house returned to quiet once more, Eleanor Whitmore felt something solidify within her. Grief had sharpened her awareness. Challenge had strengthened her resolve. She had not built her life by reacting emotionally. She had built it by planning carefully and acting decisively. That would not change now. The legal response was filed within 10 days. Eleanor did not attend the courthouse when the preliminary motions were submitted. She had no need to stand in a hallway outside a courtroom to prove resolve. Margaret Collins handled every procedural detail with steady competence, submitting documentation that traced the formation of each trust, every amendment, every notarized signature. Dates were aligned. Witnesses were documented. Financial structures were clear. There was no emotional language in those filings, only fact layered upon fact. Eleanor spent that morning as she always did, seated at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the financial section of the newspaper spread neatly before her. The sound outside her window was calm, early winter air sharpening the horizon line. She understood that the challenge would likely not survive judicial scrutiny, but she also understood something more important. Vanessa was not fighting solely for money. She was fighting for leverage. 2 weeks later, a settlement conference was scheduled in a private mediation room in Stamford. Eleanor agreed to attend in person. She wore a charcoal gray suit and a simple pearl necklace, her posture straight, her expression composed. Vanessa arrived separately with her attorney, her demeanor polished and carefully restrained. The room itself was plain, with a long table, neutral walls, and a single framed landscape print. No one raised their voice. There was no spectacle. Vanessa's attorney opened with language about fairness and shared marital expectations. Margaret responded with documented evidence of independent wealth established long before the marriage and legally insulated by explicit trust language. Eleanor remained silent through most of the exchange, listening to each argument as if evaluating a business proposal. When asked directly whether she would consider expanding Vanessa's distribution in exchange for withdrawal of the claim, Eleanor spoke calmly. Daniel understood the structure in place, she said. He signed it. Willingly. The structure remains appropriate. Vanessa looked at her across the table, searching for hesitation. There was none. You are choosing money over family, Vanessa said quietly. Eleanor met her gaze without anger. I am choosing stewardship over pressure. The mediator requested a brief recess. During that pause, Vanessa approached Eleanor privately near the window at the end of the corridor. The courthouse parking lot stretched below them, cars arranged in orderly rows. This could end differently, Vanessa said, her voice softer than before. You could increase the distribution, and we could move forward without this tension. Eleanor turned slightly toward her. Tension does not disappear because it is paid away, she replied. Vanessa's eyes glistened, though whether from frustration or genuine emotion was unclear. I lost my husband, she said. I deserve stability. Eleanor's expression did not change. You will have stability, she answered, within boundaries that protect long-term purpose. Vanessa exhaled sharply and stepped back. When the session resumed, her attorney requested additional review time. Eleanor understood what that meant. The strength of the documentation was evident. By late afternoon, the mediation concluded without agreement, but with a clear understanding from all parties that litigation would be prolonged and uncertain for Vanessa. That evening, Eleanor returned home before sunset. The house felt quiet but not fragile. She removed her coat, placed her handbag on the side table, and walked to the study. She opened the documentation folder and added a final note summarizing the mediation outcome. Then she opened her laptop and reviewed confirmation from the scholarship committee. The first application cycle had already drawn interest from dozens of high school seniors across Connecticut. Letters of recommendation were arriving daily. Essays describing ambition and resilience were being submitted through the secure portal. Eleanor read several that evening, pausing at one written by a young woman from New Haven who hoped to become a civil engineer. The clarity of the student's goals reminded Eleanor of Daniel at 18, restless and determined. Outside, the winter wind moved steadily across Long Island Sound, rattling the bare branches along the shoreline. A week later, Vanessa's attorney formally withdrew the challenge. The filing cited reconsideration of likelihood of success and desire to avoid unnecessary expense. Margaret called Eleanor personally to relay the news. It is over, she said simply. Eleanor thanked her and ended the call. She did not celebrate. She walked instead to the foyer and stood before Daniel's wedding photograph. Vanessa's smile in that image seemed distant now, almost from another life. Eleanor felt neither triumph nor bitterness. She felt completion. Wealth had been tested. Structure had held. That evening she prepared a simple dinner for herself and ate at the dining room table where so many family meals had once taken place. The chair across from her remained empty, but the house no longer felt threatened. The scholarship fund would begin awarding grants in the spring. Young students would carry Daniel's name into lecture halls and laboratories across the country. Purpose had replaced dispute. As darkness settled beyond the windows, Eleanor Whitmore closed the blinds and turned off the lights one by one. She had not reacted impulsively. She had not yielded to pressure. She had done what she had always done. She had protected what was entrusted to her, quietly and completely. Spring arrived along the Connecticut shoreline with a quiet steadiness that felt almost deliberate, as if the season itself respected the silence that had settled over the Whitmore house. The first wave of scholarship applications had been reviewed, and letters of acceptance were prepared for 12 students across the state. Eleanor sat at her dining room table one morning with a stack of envelopes arranged in careful rows. Each envelope carried Daniel's full name printed in dignified serif lettering at the top. Daniel Whitmore Engineering Scholarship. She ran her fingertips lightly across the embossed ink before sealing the final letter. Purpose, she had learned, did not remove grief. It redirected it. News of the withdrawn legal challenge had traveled quietly through mutual acquaintances, as such matters often did in small Connecticut communities. There was no public spectacle, no dramatic announcement. Only the absence of further filings. Vanessa had not visited in several weeks. Her SUV no longer appeared in the driveway. Her name no longer surfaced in Eleanor's planner except in the monthly distribution entry required by the trust. The payments were automatic, structured, predictable. They required no conversation. On a mild April afternoon, Eleanor attended the first scholarship orientation at a modest conference room on the campus of a local community college. She did not speak at length. She introduced herself simply as Daniel's mother and thanked the recipients for honoring his memory through their commitment to education. The students listened attentively, some nervous, some wide-eyed with possibility. One young man approached her afterward and said, "Ma'am, this changes everything for my family." Eleanor nodded, holding his gaze steadily. "Use it well," she replied. That evening, as she drove home with the sun low over Long Island Sound, she felt a quiet satisfaction that was not pride but alignment. Daniel's absence would never shrink, but his name would now move forward in ways that were constructive and lasting. 2 days later, she received a brief email from Vanessa. The message was formal and restrained. Vanessa informed her that she would be relocating to Boston for a new position and that all future correspondence could be handled through attorneys or financial advisors as outlined. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the legal conflict, only distance. Eleanor read the email once, then archived it without response. She understood that some chapters did not require closing remarks. As the weeks passed, the Whitmore house settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor resumed volunteering twice a month at the local library, reviewing financial literacy materials for community workshops. She walked each morning along the shoreline path behind her property, measuring her steps not in miles but in steadiness. The waves continued their patient movement against the rocks, unchanged by human disputes. Occasionally, she paused to watch sailboats cut across the water, remembering Daniel's old dream of owning one. She did not dwell there long. Memory was something she carried, not something she allowed to anchor her. In late May, Margaret Collins called to confirm that all remaining administrative matters had been fully resolved. No appeals had been filed. No additional claims were pending. "It is concluded," Margaret said simply. Eleanor thanked her and set the phone down gently. She walked to the study and opened the safe one more time, reviewing the finalized trust documents with quiet attention. Everything was exactly where it should be. She closed the safe and turned the key with a soft click. Later that evening, she prepared dinner for herself and set a single place at the long dining table. The chair across from her remained empty, as it would for the rest of her life. But the emptiness no longer felt threatened. It felt defined. She ate slowly, listening to the distant sound of wind brushing the windows. Afterward, she carried her plate to the kitchen and washed it by hand, just as she had done for decades. Wealth remained. Structure remained. Purpose remained. What had changed was her understanding of where strength truly lived. It was not in the number displayed on a brokerage statement. It was not in legal victories. It was in restraint, in patience, in the refusal to let grief be exploited, in the decision to transform inheritance into impact rather than leverage. As twilight settled over Long Island Sound, Eleanor Whitmore stood by the window one final time that evening. The horizon glowed faintly before fading into darkness. She did not think of battles won or conflicts avoided. She thought of 12 students opening envelopes that carried her son's name. She thought of long-term stewardship, of careful planning, of promises kept quietly. At 71, she had faced loss that no amount of money could soften. She had faced challenge that no emotion could resolve. And she had responded not with anger, not with spectacle, but with clarity. The house behind her remained large, solid, paid for in full. The accounts remained structured, disciplined, protected. And in the steady rhythm of the tide beyond the lawn, Eleanor understood something with complete certainty. She had not only preserved what her son entrusted to her, she had elevated it. Quietly, permanently. Summer settled gently over the Connecticut shoreline, bringing longer days and a quieter rhythm to the Whitmore house. The first semester funded by the Daniel Whitmore Engineering Scholarship had begun, and Eleanor now received periodic updates from the university offices. Brief letters, short progress reports, grade summaries. She read each one slowly at her dining room table, placing them in a slim binder she kept beside her planner. There was something steadying about those pages. Names, courses, credits earned. One recipient had written a handwritten note describing his first day walking into a mechanical engineering lab, overwhelmed by the scale of the equipment but determined to belong there. Eleanor read that line twice. Determined to belong. She understood that feeling more than most people realized. The Whitmore house no longer felt burdened by conflict, yet it carried memory in every corner. Daniel's graduation portrait remained in the foyer. His childhood baseball glove still rested in a cedar chest upstairs. The difference now was not the absence of grief, but the absence of threat. Vanessa's relocation to Boston had created distance that felt permanent. The structured monthly distribution continued automatically, transferred on the first of each month without discussion. There were no more letters from law firms. No more inquiries. Silence had replaced negotiation. One afternoon in early July, Eleanor received a call from an unfamiliar number. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in her intuition prompted her to answer. Vanessa's voice came through the line, softer than she remembered. "I wanted to let you know I have accepted a long-term position here," she said. "I will not be returning to Connecticut." Eleanor stood near the study window as she listened. The sound shimmered beyond the glass in bright sunlight. "I hope it is a good opportunity," she replied calmly. There was a brief pause. "I did not expect things to unfold the way they did," Vanessa continued. "I thought Daniel and I were building something together." Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "You were building something," she said. "Just not control over what preceded you." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "I understand that now," Vanessa admitted quietly. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement. "I hope you find what you are looking for in Boston," Eleanor said simply. The call ended without hostility, without warmth, just closure. That evening, Eleanor walked down the narrow path behind her house that led to the rocky edge of Long Island Sound. The tide was low, revealing smooth stones along the shoreline. She bent carefully, picking up a flat gray rock and turning it over in her hand. She remembered Daniel skipping stones here when he was 12 years old, determined to beat his own record. He had laughed when the stone finally skimmed across the water 5 times before sinking. The memory surfaced gently, without sharpness. She crouched slightly and released the rock across the surface. It skipped twice before disappearing beneath the tide. 2 was enough. In August, the scholarship committee invited her to a small luncheon honoring donors. She declined public recognition but agreed to attend quietly. During the event, one of the scholarship recipients approached her again, this time with midterm grades in hand. "I am on track to transfer to a 4-year program next year," he said proudly. Eleanor nodded, her expression composed but warm. "Stay focused," she advised. "Opportunity requires discipline." As she drove home afterward, she reflected on how discipline had shaped every significant decision in her life. Investing early, protecting assets, drafting clear legal structures. Even in grief, she had chosen discipline over impulse. That choice had preserved more than money. It had preserved dignity. Late that evening, she sat in her study reviewing quarterly statements. The numbers remained strong. Dividends reinvested. Market fluctuations balanced by long-term planning. $12 million had once felt like security. Now it felt like responsibility fulfilled. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. The house was quiet but not lonely. It held history, intention, and a future that extended beyond her own years. As darkness settled across the water outside, Eleanor Whitmore understood something with complete clarity. Loss had not diminished her. Conflict had not shaken her. The structure she built decades earlier had held firm under pressure. The legacy Daniel left behind was no longer confined to memory or photographs. It moved forward in classrooms and laboratories, in lecture halls and engineering labs where young minds shaped bridges and systems and machines that would outlast them all. Eleanor rose from her desk and turned off the lamp, leaving only the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the window. She did not measure her life by the size of her accounts anymore. She measured it by the steadiness of her decisions, by the absence of regret, by the quiet knowledge that she had protected what mattered without surrendering to fear or pressure. Outside, the tide began to rise again, steady and inevitable, just as it had for centuries. And inside the Whitmore house, Eleanor stood alone but unshaken, knowing that what she had built would endure long after every argument had faded into silence. Autumn returned to the Connecticut shoreline with the same restrained elegance it had carried the year before, but the atmosphere inside the Whitmore house was different now. The sharp edge of legal tension had dissolved into distance, and what remained was a steadier, quieter rhythm. 1 year had passed since the scholarship fund awarded its first grants. 12 students had completed their freshman year. 2 had transferred into competitive engineering programs. 1 had written a letter describing an internship at a renewable energy firm in Hartford. Eleanor read each update carefully at the dining room table, where she once reviewed estate documents under pressure. The table no longer held folders labeled documentation. It held progress reports and thank you notes. The difference was not dramatic. It was deliberate. Vanessa had not contacted her again after the brief phone call in July. The structured monthly distribution continued automatically, deposited without commentary. There were no more challenges. No more negotiations. Distance had hardened into permanence. Eleanor did not check for messages from Boston. She did not speculate about Vanessa's new life. She understood that closure did not require conversation. It required acceptance. On a cool October afternoon, Eleanor attended a small ceremony at the university where the scholarship recipients were invited to meet donors and faculty. She sat in the third row, hands folded in her lap, as one of the students delivered a short speech about opportunity and responsibility. When Daniel's name was mentioned, there was a brief, respectful pause in the room. Eleanor felt the weight of that pause settle over her like a quiet acknowledgement, not of loss alone, but of continuity. After the ceremony, a young woman approached her with a firm handshake. "I am designing a bridge model this semester," she said, her eyes bright with focus. "Your son's name is on every grant document I sign." Eleanor nodded once. "Build it strong," she replied. As she drove home along the shoreline road, the trees glowing in red and gold against the gray sky, she considered how differently the past year might have unfolded had she responded with impulse instead of structure. Wealth had once seemed like insulation against uncertainty. Now she understood it differently. Wealth was leverage. It could be surrendered under pressure or directed with intention. She had chosen intention. The Whitmore house remained unchanged in its architecture, but it no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like an anchor point. The safe behind the painting remained locked, though she rarely opened it now. The trust documents were stable. The endowment was functioning. Dividends were reinvested automatically. The accounts no longer required defensive attention. They required stewardship, and stewardship had always been her strength. One evening as winter approached, Eleanor stood at the window overlooking Long Island Sound and watched a sailboat glide slowly across the dark water. She remembered Daniel's voice years earlier, animated as he described wind angles and open horizons. He had wanted motion. She had provided foundation. Together, those forces had created balance. Even in his absence, that balance remained. The following week, a handwritten envelope arrived from one of the scholarship recipients. Inside was a photograph of a small group of students standing beside a prototype solar-powered device they had built in a campus laboratory. On the back of the photograph, the student had written, "Thank you for believing in futures you will never personally see." Eleanor read that line slowly. Futures you will never personally see. The words did not sadden her. They steadied her. Legacy was never about personal recognition. It was about continuity. Later that night, she walked once more along the narrow path behind her house to the rocky edge of the Sound. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and fallen leaves. She paused at the waterline, listening to the tide move in its measured rhythm. There had been a moment, months earlier, when pressure had attempted to turn her grief into vulnerability. She had not allowed it. She had absorbed it, examined it, and responded with discipline. That discipline had preserved more than capital. It had preserved intention. As she turned back toward the house, lights glowing warmly in the windows, Eleanor Whitmore understood that strength did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moved quietly through legal documents, through careful planning, through restrained conversations in mediation rooms. Sometimes it moved through scholarship letters and semester grades. She had lost her only child. No amount of money could alter that truth. But she had refused to let that loss be exploited or redirected by urgency. She had protected what he entrusted to her and transformed it into something durable. The house behind her remained solid, the account structured, the future funded. And in the steady rise and fall of the tide beyond her lawn, she recognized a simple, unwavering reality. Grief had tested her. Conflict had tested her. Structure had held. And in holding, it had carried her forward, not as a woman defined by what was taken, but as one defined by what she chose to protect and what she chose to build.